Thank you for joining this four-part webinar series presented by the Diamond and Double Diamond sponsors of the Council for the Study of Community Colleges. Thanks to all of the CSCC sponsors as well for their continued support. And now, on to the webinar.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Raina Dyer-Barr, and I'm an Assistant Director with the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, which is the home office for the Council for the Study of Community Colleges. Just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today for this final presentation in our webinar series, which is being sponsored by our 2020 CSCC Diamond and Double Diamond sponsors. Today's webinar is being presented by Iowa State. And just a housekeeping note before we get started, everyone should be muted, and we'd like to ask that you remain that way for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we'll return to those at the end during the question and answer session. And with that, we'll just go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to our presenters for today.
Alrighty, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Doran. I am an assistant professor at Iowa State University. I am in the Division of Higher Education, and the main focus of my teaching and research duties are on community college leadership. I'm also the historian for the Council for the Study of Community Colleges. Part of how this session came about was in part what Raina mentioned, that we are a diamond sponsor for the CSCC conference. Iowa State has always had a very deep love for CSCC, and so that's money that we try to set aside every year. As part of that, we were asked to put together a session that highlighted the expertise within our program. I am admittedly not a rural community college person, but my colleagues are, so I am here to moderate so that you can hear from their wisdom and their brilliance. One thing I would be remiss to not mention is that for folks who are interested themselves or have graduate students who are interested, we do offer an MED program that is completely online where students can focus on community college leadership. We also have an EDD program where people can focus on community college leadership, and we do have the capacity to support folks who want to get a PhD and are interested in focusing on community colleges or community college leadership. And so with that, I will go ahead and introduce my colleagues. We have Dr. Jan Friedel, we have Dr. Doug Smith, Dr. Zoe Thornton, and Dr. Chris Dury. And let me move this forward. And so I will kick it off to Jan.
Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Can everyone hear me? Okay, welcome again. What does rural mean? What does it mean to be a rural community college? My time working in community colleges goes back to the early 1980s in eastern Iowa, when the Midwest was struck with a terrible agricultural recession. And what happened in the Midwest, in the predominantly rural states of the Midwest, those characteristics were not being experienced in other parts of the country. And so the states took it upon themselves out of necessity, to develop economic programs to help bring themselves out of a predominantly rural economy to diversified. And they went to the community colleges to be primary leaders and players in that initiative. Rural community colleges, according to Pam Eddy, comprise 45% of all community colleges in the country. They enroll the majority of students at community colleges. There are a growing number of people in rural communities over the age of 25 that have an associate degree. And from 2000 and 2015, that proportion of their population with an associate degree grew from 9%, 6% to 9% between 2000 and 2015. Now that is well below the national average of the population that holds at least an associate degree. The median income in our rural communities is nationwide about $31,000, below the $39,000 for the rest of the nation. The death rate surpasses the birth rate, and so the populations in these areas are declining. The population of this community colleges is declining. The fastest growing segment of the population in rural communities in Iowa is the over 85 age group. That portion of the population is fast surpassing all the other age, when we start looking at the ages below 15, 18 to 24, 24 to 30, 30 to 39, etc. That's very telling of what the rural community colleges look like and what they will look like in the future. There is the Rural Community College Alliance that I've been a long time participant in and have presented at their national conference. And at the latest national conference, there were only 2 universities there. 2 people who reported on research that's being done regarding rural communities and rural community colleges. And those 2 institutions have participated in the last 3 to 4 years. Iowa State is one of them. And the discussion took place in the informal manner as the group went on a drive through the countryside. And the host college said, "Isn't this beautiful?" And he said, when we talk about rural, we mean the country, the countryside, outside of urban areas. And people, when you ask them if they live in a rural community, they say we live in the country. And they start describing what it means to live in the countryside, breathe fresh air, be away from bright lights. And so when we start looking at what is the research, they talked about too, he talked about the disconnect between our research institutions and the rural or country community colleges. And that wouldn't it be nice if their organization could develop a list of what their needs are and be able to take that to a group of researchers and say, this is the kind of information that we need. This would help us when we go to DC and advocate on our behalf. And they do that. I know the AACC now has a special interest group, maybe it's a commission on rural community colleges, but there is this other group that has been long-standing, finding great dissatisfaction with the AACC, that they've had to form their own organization. The Rural Community College Alliance has moved from Oklahoma and is now in Iowa, officed at the Iowa Association of Community College Trustees. That is where the RCCA is now located, their office. So it makes for a wonderful opportunity for Iowa State to have that group now in our state. So the question remains, how do we link our capabilities to do research and to engage our graduate students looking for dissertation topics that will be useful, be unique to the practice, and to help improve the practice? How do we get those linked together? That is a challenge that we have. And Erin, that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And now I will throw.
Thanks, Erin. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Doug Smith, and I'm an associate professor of community college leadership with Dr. Friedel, Thornton, and Doree and Doran here. So I think where Jan left us off is really where I want to pick up, and I want to talk a little bit more about what the current status of rural community college research is that's been frankly published in the last handful of years. And frankly, to many, there's probably not a great surprise here. And last week, I spent some time in Google Scholar searching for the terms rural community college, looking for peer-reviewed work, specifically in the last 4 years, to verify what I thought I knew about the body of work of rural community college research that's been published. And just for the ease of not spending the whole week in the literature, I looked primarily for works that had rural community college in the title or the abstract. And what I found was frankly not all that surprising on the journal article side of things. In that I located 25 peer-reviewed research articles that identified a focus of rural community college, and half of them appeared in 3 journals that many of us are the most familiar with. The New Directions for Community College, and primarily that was driven by a special issue on rural community colleges that my colleague Zoe Thornton and others worked on. So if you haven't checked that out, please check that out. I believe it came out in the last year to year and a half. There's been articles in the Community College Journal of Research and Practice, a handful in the Community College Review that are explicitly focused on rural community colleges. But the other half of the 25 articles were all single occurrences in journals, ranging from the Journal of Research in Rural Education, which primarily is focused on K-12 rural research, the Journal of Hispanic Higher Education, diverse issues in higher education, the Texas Education Review, but all had a single article that was explicitly focused on rural in the title or the abstract in my quick search. And while I located 25 peer-reviewed journal articles, what was probably most surprising was the number of rural community college-focused dissertations. I found in the last 4 years, just in a quick Google Scholar search, at least 66 rural community college-focused dissertations in the last 4 years. And, that's quite impressive. And that well over doubles the number of journal articles that have been published. But I think it's important that we note and we recognize that the vast majority of these dissertations are coming from current community college practitioners themselves while they're completing doctoral degrees. And even a number of the journal articles are published by active or retired practitioners and not university faculty. It's a much smaller number if we try to parse that out. So what we need to recognize is that these practitioners that are writing these dissertations that are driving much of the rural community college work are short on time, they're short on money, and frankly, they're going to be short on resources to complete this work. And while there's a range of quality in these community college dissertations, these rural community college dissertations specifically, there's a number of them that are very high quality, conducted on rural issues. But most of these works are not turning into journal articles later on that can reach a broader scholar practitioner audience. And that's something I'll come back to here in just a minute. But another area of challenge that Jan started us down the path of that I want to follow back to is this idea of defining rural is complex and complicated. The Carnegie classifications for higher ed institutions, the 2018 classifications, no longer include the rural, urban, suburban serving aspect of the size and setting definitions that they did that were first implemented, I believe, back in 2006. And that effort was led by Steve Katsinas and David Hardy. And that used to be an avenue that would easily I flag researchers, practitioners to the 500 some odd community colleges that are rural serving. And that primarily was pointing to, if you're not familiar with that, to the US Census data, looking at primary metropolitan statistical areas, and looking at really low density, a low population. But that census data, while it's still available, the lack of including that in the Carnegie classifications really removed a standard definition that was easily accessible to us as researchers. And in its absence, we have to be more intentional in seeking out that data ourselves to confirm, determine, support a rural community college classification. Otherwise, we're really leaning on a self-classification. We're going to call this a rural community college. And, Carnegie classification, the Carnegie Foundation opens up for public comment from time to time. I believe their next update's probably not coming out till 2021. And I think we have to be more intentional in using those public comment periods to provide feedback on our thoughts on the removal of the rural classification aspect of that. Another note, Jan mentioned the Rural Community College Alliance. I want to point just a second to the work that's happening out of the Association of Community College Trustees. They have a Gates Foundation funded rural community college initiative that is primarily focused right now on understanding rural community college challenges and specifically working towards a better definition of what rural means in the community college. Right there, I believe there's still a data collection and writing the report. Many of us at Iowa State participated in their data collection last spring, really early last spring. And some of you on this call may have as well. But I think while the report is yet to be released, I think there's going to be some strong recommendations for how to improve the definition and the conceptualizing of what a rural community college is. Because really part of that complexity is these differing definitions that we have. The Census Bureau is primarily looking at population sizes. IPEDS and USDA is using similar things. They're looking at distance from urban centers, which are, looking at those in itself and singularly are somewhat flawed. And I think CCT is looking at a more complex definition. So I'll be interested to see what comes out of that. And those measures identify differing numbers of rural community colleges, which causes challenges, especially when you have differing federal definitions, especially when we start thinking about when funding eligibility for special funding eligibility may be attached to these definitions. So I want to flip to what can we do? And if Erin, if you want to move to the next slide. I think just in our observations, yep, that one, being more intentional in focusing our community college studies and our research on the rural context, and not just by chance. That's who responded, that's who I had access to, but being more intentional in our planning of our work, in focusing on understanding the complex nature of rural community colleges. So putting the rural context at the center of not only our studies, but then in our writings. And it's as simple as in part including the rural focus in the abstract and in the title. And in part, maybe why I found more rural focused dissertations is those titles sometimes are a little longer. Maybe the abstracts are a little longer, so they pop out a little cleaner. But if we can be more intentional, even those of us that are on the faculty research side, of making the context more intentional, it may help bring this body of work a little tighter together. And then third, encouraging and supporting our doctoral graduates to write journal articles. The latest APA manual has a section in chapter 12 specifically about adapting dissertations into journal articles. And I would really encourage all of us to consider, if you're on the faculty track, encouraging our students to look at that. If you're a doctoral student, look at that for when you're done with your doctoral research on how you can transform your dissertation into a journal article. And if a student does not want to develop a journal article, we know many of these are happening from time-limited practitioners. How can we think on the university perspective? How can we support our students in disseminating findings to a broader audience of scholar practitioners? Can we encourage our students to develop shorter issue or research briefs that can be posted on university websites for a place that can be, that these findings can be more easily cited in a more accessible fashion rather than a super large dissertation that's just housed in a dissertation repository? And, I think we're starting those conversations at Iowa State, and I'd be interested to hear later on maybe what some others are thinking of doing, specifically, especially as we have EDD dissertations for, on applied problems of practice, but specifically being intentional about how we are sharing those results with key state and local stakeholders to inform practice, and not just letting those go straight into a repository without thinking about the application. And frankly, we can have these same conversations with our own faculty work as well about how we can enhance broader dissemination outside of just our journal outlets, and thinking about, our practitioners truly digging into our journals. How else can we leverage our positions at universities? We have websites that hopefully we can, carve out space maybe to do some of those work. The last note I want to make before moving on is just thinking about how we can expand our rural collaborations and partnerships among faculty that are doing this work. We see, when you look at the works that have been published, we do a good job of encouraging students to do this work, but how are we collaborating across states, across universities, and not just the work that's happening within state silos or university silos or within our graduate students, and how can we enhance those partnerships within faculty and then with our community college partners to help support their practice. And on that point, I want to transition to a conversation of identifying pressing needs for community college research. So I'm going to turn to my colleagues, Chris Duree and Zoe Thornton. Dr. Duree has recently served as a rural community college chancellor, and Dr. Zoe Thornton, before joining the Iowa State faculty, was in the Iowa Department of Education, working closely with workforce development efforts.
Good morning, all. I'm Zoe Thornton. I'm an assistant professor of practice and thrilled to be on this call. You can probably tell rural is a passion of ours. And so drawing on our team's collective interests and expertise, we've generated a list of rural research needs as a beginning for a conversation. In no way do we mean to for this to be an exhaustive list, and we absolutely would be remiss to not note that the current pandemic has created many more complexities for rural serving community colleges, which must also be given research attention as well. Our snapshot here is also informed by our continuous engagement with the presidents and senior leaders within Iowa's community colleges and throughout the Midwest. Anecdotally, we know that many of these issues are the things keeping rural leaders up at night, while others on this list are areas in which some rural community colleges are doing very well. So we're ripe for research endeavors here. So as our colleague most recently retired from the field, I'll turn to Chris now to share his perspective on our rural research requests that we have here. Chris?
Thanks, Zoe. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for giving us your time this morning. As Doug and Zoe have mentioned, I retired a year ago last summer from the community college presidency and served 10 years in that role. 1 year prior to that as community college provost, and then prior to that, just shy of a decade as vice president of academic affairs, also at a small rural community college here in Iowa. So just for the record, I'm the practitioner of the group, and the rest of this team are far more scholarly than I am and much more intelligent. But they did ask me to put this generate a list, and I'm going to tell you up front that just about every one of these, in my opinion, could be framed around the big umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you'll hear me make reference to that, and I can also just tell you from my experiences out in the field that it's a pressing need in every one of these areas. And I'll start by saying, and I'll put some of this in the context of the Midwest, Iowa specifically. In the mid-60s, when the community colleges were formed in Iowa, there were over 700 public school districts. Fast forward that tape to the present, there are now fewer than 350, which speaks to the changes in the demographic shifting that Dr. Friedel mentioned and Doug touched on. There's dramatic demographic shifting going on in the Midwest. And I would also reference a couple of other books. Some of you have probably read at least parts, if not all of these, but there were a couple books that came out in the last 10 years. One called Hollowing Out the Middle, the Rural Brain Drain and What It Means for America. And the other one was Flight of the Creative Class by Richard Florida. Patrick Carr and Maria Kafalis authored the Hollowing Out the Middle book. And they're both spot on. And I witnessed firsthand during my time in the community colleges, out in the trenches, literally everything they spoke to in those two books. But moving along. So I've mentioned the demographic shifting. Here in Iowa and across the Midwest, we have several rural communities that will soon be majority minority. And specifically in the last 20 to 30 years, a huge surge of the Latinx population. I, for one, have been very thankful for that for a lot of different reasons, but at any rate, that drives the need for recruiting and retaining faculty and staff of color. Strong believer, and I mentioned this in my own research and some publications, that faculty and staff in our community colleges should be in direct relationship to the percentage of persons of color and all the different demographics that we see in the community colleges. Recruiting and retaining faculty and staff of color is a huge issue. And so I'll move on to fundraising, foundations, and institutional advancement. The reason I bring this up, and this is again based on my direct firsthand experience when I was chancellor and dealing with two separate foundations, mostly comprised of Caucasian, aging, senior citizens that are very loyal to the community college, but in many respects, they have their blinders on as to what's going on right under their nose with the demographic shifting and the population shifting and the student makeup of their campuses. And the reason I bring that up, I think most of us would recognize that financial barriers are huge for underrepresented populations. And so I put this on here because I think it bears examining what our foundation's doing to provide funding opportunities for undocumented students, minority students, and so on. I imagine you get the point. I'm limited here in my time, so I'll keep moving. Of course, collaboration and partnership for workforce and economic development, key for all community colleges, regardless of size, but in particular with the shrinking demographics out in rural Midwest in particular, and I suspect other rural areas across the country. What our community college is doing rural community colleges doing? What are best practices in collaborating and partnering for workforce and economic development? And in particular, again, paying strict attention to the needs of our underrepresented populations. Same is true with supporting small business development. I worked with several different chambers of commerce in my area during my tenure as chancellor. And again, mostly comprised of Caucasian, in many cases males, but certainly starting to see a much greater balance of females, also Caucasian. The problem with that is they don't understand the needs of supporting small business development for our underrepresented populations. They're outstanding small business entrepreneurs. And what are rural community colleges doing specifically to work with their economic development corporations, their chambers, to bring our underrepresented populations, make them feel comfortable and feel part of the community, and assisting them with small business development. Probably even brought further to light because of our current COVID-19 crisis. That certainly has brought to light and put it right in the middle of the bullseye, serving the technology needs for low socioeconomic and underrepresented students. And we have, at least in many rural pockets across the state and across the Midwest, still don't have the high-speed internet access and even the hardware, making that available to our low socioeconomic and underrepresented students. I'll move on to enrollment management. What are rural community colleges specifically doing to manage their enrollment, and see this as a wonderful opportunity to recruit and retain underrepresented populations. And then I also put in the whole issue of dual credit or concurrent enrollment, because we're finding that there are also disparities in access to our underrepresented populations out in the high schools that would like to seek dual credit opportunities while they're still in high school. And then finally, succession planning and leadership development. And that goes right back to recruiting and retaining faculty and staff of color. The same is true for leadership. We've done a great job of promoting females and into leadership positions, at least here in our state of Iowa. And I think we've seen that across the Midwest in general. However, there's still a huge void in succession planning and leadership development with due consideration to persons of color. If we can recruit and retain faculty and staff, work with them through leadership development programs, promote them into leadership positions, then we'll finally get the balance we need with CEOs, both male and female persons of color. And that should be a part of everyone's succession planning. Really, I don't care where you are, but in particular, it becomes even more difficult for smaller rural community colleges. And then finally, the last one, regionalization and consolidation. I put that on there only because I'll give you the example, and people would have to weigh in on what's going across their own specific regions. But there are 15 community college service areas in Iowa. That was all designed specifically around 15 area education agencies in Iowa, and that was in the mid-60s when I mentioned, which is why I started with it, that there were over 700 community school districts. Well, now there are less than 350. The 8 area education agencies that serve the K-12s and work with the community colleges in partnership have consolidated. And the question is, if all these other areas aren't addressed, will further regionalization also happen? to rural community colleges? In other words, will they get sucked in to the service areas of the much larger community colleges? So that's my list, and hopefully my wonderful timekeeper, Dr. Thornton, I've stayed within my time range and will, I think, open it up to questions.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen just so we can see each other more as a community than just staring at a slide. I want to say, thank you. There's been a really interesting conversation going on in the chat. I want to thank Carlos for getting that started for us. I think that overall, Rosalinda brought up a really great point about how managing dual credit during COVID with current technological capabilities have been especially difficult for instructors. I think that it's just interesting to think how COVID and just 2020 in general has impacted many of the things that Chris was talking about in terms of community college priorities. I think that there's a lot to be cautiously optimistic about with, a first lady, an incoming first lady who is a community college instructor and advocate, considering that DACA is now taking applications again following last week's judge ruling. So, hopefully the community college work can continue and improve. So I have a list of discussion questions for the panel, but I would also very much love to have folks from the audience either put them in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask the panel, please feel free to do so now. Okay, no takers. That's fine. I know it may take a minute if you are typing into the chat box. Oh, I hear.
Hey, I got a question. This is Carlos. I like to talk a lot. And actually, one of my professors on here is Dr. Sue Cater. Wonderful person, great class. So I'm glad to see her on here as well. I'm a doctoral candidate at Northern Arizona University. One of the questions I had, and I think somebody asked it in the chat, I'm not sure, is how do we get beyond the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion and put that to action, right? Like, how does that happen? I mean, because there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of banter. It's just like politics today. We talk about, racism, which is a social construct now, right? And we talk about it, but nobody does anything about it. You know what I mean? There's nothing being done. So how do we stop talking about it and start making it actionable, if that makes sense?
Carlos, this is Chris Dury. I'll take a shot at that. You have to, and I'm going to go back to my days in the trenches. We have to have leadership that's willing to take that on and build it quite intentionally into strategic planning, value statements, mission statements, and then have metrics to measure whether or not you're achieving. In other words, if you're putting your money where your mouth is, making sure that it is a priority. And we have to have leadership, in my opinion, that's promoting that throughout the entire organization, from hiring to student recruitment and retention, having services built in to the programming and on campus that take care of the specific needs. And that's true of faculty and staff of color as well. Foundations, which is why I had that on the list. Either that, and I'll give you an example. When I first started, and maybe it was a bold move early on, but I went to the foundation boards and specifically asked them, and they hadn't even thought about, they hadn't even been on their radar, but asked them to remove citizenship barriers off of all scholarships. It was like kind of, as we say here in the Midwest, a deer in the headlight look. And one foundation in particular just couldn't get, of course, this is about 15 years ago now, but, and so to role model how harmless that would be, my wife and I started our own scholarship specifically for undocumented students. And the first criteria was that you didn't have to be a documented citizen. And I can't tell you how many students we helped break their financial barriers to be able to do that. So it just has to be a priority. And we don't, in many cases, we don't have that type of bold leadership, but at the same time, it's very much needed. And another example, even promoting that in the economic development and chambers of commerce, bringing that to their attention. We started a scholarship fund at Marshalltown Community College called the Marshalltown Education Partnership that has now served over 500 students that are first generation college students, that if they meet the criteria while they're still in high school, when they come to the college, the partnership makes a financial match, and the community college made the match. They could go the first 2 years basically tuition free. So Marshalltown Community College is now on its way to being, we hope, the first Hispanic serving institution in Iowa. So it's all about leadership to me, and that just takes bold, courageous action on the part of institutional leaders. And I'll get off my soapbox, but feel very strongly about that topic.
Can I jump in to follow Chris? Thank you, Chris. As a former practitioner from Maricopa in Arizona, what for you researchers and scholars out there, what we definitely need more of is more board research. We know the demographics of governing boards everywhere. Governing boards and trustees are one of the most understudied aspect of higher education generally, or community colleges, certainly, higher education maybe generally. And the boards are going to pick who they pick, and that style and expectations are going to continue to flow down. It's not, for decades we've said our leadership needs to mirror our students. This isn't new. Please don't put it in your findings as great new research. We've known this forever. I reject proposals after proposals for articles when they say community colleges should. We know this. This is a given. We need specifics, and we need deeper research in how to do that. And I just want to put a plug in there for more governance, particularly trustees research, piggybacking on all the great points that Chris made. So, because until change happens everywhere, we're going to end up, we can't succession plan because we're public institutions. We can't do that to the level that we should be able to if we were a private entity. So I'll get off my soapbox too. Chris.
I couldn't agree with you more, and we should add that to the list, because until we have governance at all levels that are equally represented, therein lies yet another part of the problem. And
I'll give you an example. I'll give you a direct example
right now for not having added that on my list, having worked with boards for
not at all.
years. So
we had a trustee. We had a governing board member when I was Associate Vice Chancellor of Maricopa Community Colleges, 200,000 students. And I'm in charge of strategic planning. And I'm trying to put the words social justice into our strategic plan. And a governing board member publicly stood up and said, I don't know what this social justice stuff is, and I don't know why it belongs in a mission statement. And then proceeded to write the legislature and say they don't need any money because they have more money than they need. And I could go on and on and on. So I'll really stop this time.
Well, Sue, say hi to Maria Harper Marinick for me. I assume you know her well.
Okay, so I want to first call attention. Kate just wanted to make sure that I gave a shout out to Raquel Rawl at UC Riverside and some of her colleagues who were doing great research on governance and equity. And then Brad had a great question. It's, could the panel speak about research threads and topics related to community development and partnerships beyond workforce and economic development? Of course, workforce and economic development is a core function of community colleges, but I sense that rural communities often look to their community colleges for cultural and social offerings as well.
That's Jan Friedel. That certainly is true. One of my students who completed his dissertation and graduated did his study on rural communities. And one of his findings, it was a qualitative study, was the overwhelming presence of the community college in community development and serving as a center for the people to come together and develop a sense of community and support each other in terms of providing a center for cultural events, for sports, for discussions regarding a new industry, concerns about a highway being rerouted outside from going through their small city to going around their small community. And so it was not surprising to me at all, the many comments in his collection of his record of comments being made and the support that came out from those participants in the role that the community college has in keeping their community vital.
I would like to add as well, you know, we with all of the financial burdens and economic impacts from the current pandemic, we don't know how that's going to play out. These the community outreach and non-credit offerings, senior classes, cultural events, those all come with a cost. And what is going to have to be the balance that our rural community colleges play as they move into the next couple of years with some severe budget crises. So that is both a concern and definitely an area ripe for research. As was it Brad noted that that got us started on this conversation, that truly the community college in a rural area quite often is the driver of many initiatives to improve the health of that community, even when it's not directly related to credit programming. And in some cases, it might just be adding the name of the community college or hosting the meetings. And as Sue noted, community college leaders are fantastic strategic planners. And so it might just be offering those human resources to those community initiatives to assist in the planning and process of those. So there are major impacts that are going to be happening on this important work that's been happening in our rural communities, within which the community college plays a significant part. So thank you for that question.
You know, another point that I'd like to add is that the rural community colleges have a different set of circumstances in responding to COVID. One of the employees at Clinton Community College made a comment in a discussion that I was leading regarding the lack of Wi-Fi in the entire community college area, and where students were driving into parking lots where Wi-Fi would be available to them, and sitting in their cars and taking the online classes. I don't know how prevalent that occurs in our cities and in the urban community colleges, but access to technology and educational opportunities through technologies is a challenge.
So I just want to draw some attention. So first, Elizabeth did say a key concern due to all things associated with COVID is the very cultural and social offerings in our rural community colleges that would be cut. And then Priya Darshini wrote, community partnerships are also key for expanding the suite of financial supports for students beyond traditional forms of financial aid, including public benefits, utilities assistance, technology, etc. So we know that it's far beyond just tuition assistance or access to the institution. It's basic needs as well.
I wanted to jump in, sorry, Erin, about something that Doug had said about the comparison with the dissertations that come out versus the journal articles that are published. And you had just looked recently in all the dissertations. I just finished mine in May, and I didn't put rural in my title, but it was focused on a rural community college. But I liked what you said about encouraging or finding ways for students that, especially practitioners, that we finish our dissertations and then we don't continue to journals. If there's other avenues like research reports or other places to publish them, if there was a space for us to, turn that into something different so that it could be collected and disseminated, because in my opinion, unless you're in a graduate program or, outside of the community college, usually community college practitioners don't always go to the journals to look for the information. They need something kind of quick and dirty somewhere on the internet that they can get to really fast. So if there was a space for that, I think more of us that are practitioners that do the dissertations would have a place to put them. So I just wanted to just share that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm sure we're not the only faculty that's having this conversation. Is it a matter of, as we have people submit their final draft, we haven't put together an expanded abstract, 3, 4, 5 pages that can be just pulled out of what they submitted already to be able to put somewhere else that's not just the dissertation repository. We've talked about having our doctoral students present at a single meeting of the state's community college presidents and leaders, or at the state community college conference, and just trying to reach the folks that can benefit from our work is in small, simple ways, I think are much needed, that we don't frankly see a lot of. I didn't see much of that when I was in South Carolina. We don't probably do enough of that in Iowa, but we have a lot of students that are writing dissertations just like you are on rural community colleges.
Hey, Erin, this is Chris. I had a question asked, and this gets into our discussion that we had the other day on how you define rural community colleges. The question specifically was, how many community colleges out of the 15 in Iowa do I consider rural? And I would frame that probably by saying approximately 12 out of the 15 without any question. And the other 3 certainly have satellite campuses out in very rural communities. And so even though their main campus would be probably not considered at this point rural. Just so the group that's on today understands, we had a pretty lengthy discussion about this on Monday, and it's really hard to get our arms around a clear definition of rural community college. So, because if I'm not mistaken, and Zoe, maybe you want to speak to this, or Doug, but I believe the Carnegie Foundation has dismissed their original criteria for what they consider a small, medium, or large rural community college.
Yeah, they've taken rural out of the rural, urban, suburban notation out of the classifications, which I think was part of what ACCT is discussing as part of their initiative, and how can we more comprehensively identify and describe and not just to classify, but to better understand rural community colleges, not just to create a bucket of these are rural, these are suburban, but it's more complex than just three buckets to place institutions in. We have our most urban community college in Iowa with Des Moines Area Community College has several very rural satellite campuses. So how do we capture that?
So Dick had a comment in the chat box that says enrollments in non-credit programs for rural community colleges do not show up in iPads. Since iPads is a major source of data and research, this leads to an inaccurate picture of not only enrollments, but also cost per FTE. Colleges are actually much poorer than iPad shows.
Absolutely.
So we are about 4 minutes an hour. So sorry, what was that, Zoe?
I was just going to say, you've noted another area, another reason for more research. There's a lot of work happening in non-credit and the transition from non-credit to credit. So it's just one more area for a body of research then to support that need for a national warehouse of that data to depict the actual picture that our community colleges have. There are pockets of some data systems that are attempting that. So it's exciting to see where that will go, but yet another reason for more rural research. So.
Okay, since we're at about 3 minutes to the hour, I want to see if there's one more question or any sort of lingering comments before we wrap up.
I have one, and I was debating about even just bringing it up, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's funny. I've been in some of my classes since COVID has started. We've got moved over to online. And as I said before, Dr. Sue Cater was one of my professors, wonderful professor. She's helped me focus more on my APA. She's amazing. But anyways, I noticed that when we've had these difficult conversations, about, race, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's always seems like it's a black and white binary when we talk about that. And I've actually gotten private messages from my, Hispanic counterparts that would say, why are we invisible in these conversations? It's a black and white binary. And for me, I just want to change that narrative, because we are a demographic that's representative, here in the US, and we should have a seat at that table when it comes to conversations such as these. I know there's all inclusivity, President Reagan uses the term all, Hispanic from Mexican, Puerto Rican, everything else like that. But I think for me, it just gets to the point where, why do, a lot of my counterparts feel invisible like that? So I kind of want to change that narrative, and I'm doing it so respectfully, and I like to look at a lot of cases, like Plessy versus Ferguson, Mendez versus Westminster, that by and large part set precedent for Brown versus Board of Education. A lot of people don't realize that, but it did, so, I think that's just kind of where I'm at right now. And, and I tell my colleagues, I go, the way we change that narrative is if we speak up. We're the majority minority in this country. We need to start speaking up and back all those that are being oppressed by, structural racism that we see now today, and stand as one voice, not as disparate voices, Black, Asian, Indigenous, stand as one voice, one minority voice. I guess that's my comment for this.
All right. Thank you. And I think understanding even just intergroup nuance, I mean, there's a lot of diversity amongst Latinx populations. And so, I think at the heart of rural and community college work, we know that it's deeply nuanced, deeply contextual considerations that have to be taken into account. So, well, since we're at the hour, I want to thank everyone for being here, for the great conversation, not only from the panelists, but also as it was going on in the chat function. It was wonderful to have some time with y'all this Wednesday morning, and stay healthy, stay joyful, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the CSCC virtual webinar series. Please visit our website at cscconline.education.illinois.edu to learn more about the Council for the Study of Community Colleges